Good morning, learners, and welcome back to the workshop lecture series titled Literary Theory and Criticism. So, today we are going to discuss structuralism. Now, talking about the structuralists, they are not interested in individual literary texts or works or any individual phenomena. Uh, Rather, they are interested in the underlying structure. So they want to see what the individual items can tell us about a structure as a whole, a structure that underlie or structures that underlie and organize all items of the similar kind. So, according to Terence Hawkes, reality inheres not in things themselves, but in the relationships that we perceive between things. So, not in items, but in structures. So, rather than individual works or texts or phenomenon, the structuralists would emphasize on the underlying structure that hold similar items together. So, structuralism sees itself as a human science that tries to understand in a systematic fashion the fundamental structures that underlie all human experience. So, rather than a field of study, it could be called as a method of systematizing human experience, which is used in many different fields. So, the structuralist thought or the structuralist critical school can be applied towards understanding linguistics, anthropology, sociology, psychology, among other disciplines, and of course, literary studies. So, when we look at the structuralist, or structuralism as a concept, the world comprises two levels. One that is visible, the other that is invisible. So, the visible world consists of the surface phenomena with countless arbitrary objects, activities, and behaviors that we observe at the everyday level. But the invisible world consists of structures which underlie and organize all these phenomena into structures so we can make sense of them. So basically, these structures are made by humans. There is nothing natural about them. And otherwise, when we talk about things existing in a uh, everyday world, they are arbitrary, they are random, they are haphazard. The only way of making sense of these, countless phenomena going on around us is through grouping them, classifying them into structures. So, similar items are put under one structure. That is the idea of structuralism. For instance, our ability to construct simple sentences depends on internalization of a grammatical structure. So we converse with each other in a common language because we are part of a metalinguistic system. We have all been trained in uh, in a certain way to learn a language. So we know the grammatical structure of subject, verb, object, right? So no language is possible without a structuring system that governs communication. So there is a common premise that binds two people speaking in the same language. According to Frederick Jameson, structuralism intends to suspend a common sense view of a work of art as mimesis or in terms of its content. Rather, it would emphasize a notion of a complete dominance of form. So, once again, form over content becomes the onus of the structuralists. So, content is a function of literary form that is not something separable from it or perceptible beyond it or through it. So, while a work only seems to have content, in reality, it speaks only of its own coming into being, its own construction. So, this is very similar to what the formalists were saying. that we discussed in our previous lecture. The fact that the form itself carries the meaning, and within the form, the content is embedded. So they cannot really be separated, right? The form itself is the content. So it comes to speak about itself through its own construction. So the process of defamiliarization or australeny that leads to a genre called magical realism also presupposes and requires the existence of a body of familiar material which seems to have content. So even when we are talking about a takeoff from reality or real signifiers and signifieds, we still, think of defamiliarization in terms of familiar material. So there ought to be something familiar in order for us to identify something else as unfamiliar, or a process of defamiliarization, right? So here we see that structuralism has been studied in great detail by scholars such as scholars, writers, critics who have made very important contributions. One such is the Russian folklorist Vladimir Prop. His concern is with the norms by which narrative structures work, the units of content in which they seem to deal, and he attempts at a taxonomy of narrative structures, pointing out how the fairy tales, you know, how the fairy tales actually uh, play as an important prototype of all narratives, right? The fairy tales become the edifice for all the narratives around the world, according to Prop. So when Prop is interested in horizontal structuralism, comprising a linear syntagmatic analysis of folk tales or studying the sequence of events in time, on the other hand, we see anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss approaches through the vertical or uh, paradigmatic axis. So Claude Lévi-Strauss breaks down myth into smallest narrative unit, which he calls as mytheme. And the mythemes are grouped in order to understand the underlying binary oppositions that any myth mediates. So, without the structuring principles which allow us to organize and understand the world, uh, there would be a lot of data being provided to our five senses, which might be very overwhelming and, in fact, meaningless to us. So, structuralism is a science which discovers the structures that underlie the surface phenomena around us. It is an effort at perceiving too many facts through the grids of limited and organized conceptual systems. So, structuring principles enable us to differentiate among different groups within a given domain. So, if we are students of botany, for example, we might differentiate plant life in terms of their medicinal properties from plant life with harmful properties, and further those with neutral properties. So these are classifications that enable us to group the different plants in terms of their benefits or their functions. So the order that we see in the world is basically the order that we are imposing on it. So there is nothing natural about these structures or these classifications. They don't exist naturally in the uh, world system. So the structures that we perceive around us are basically um, part of our consciousness, which we project onto the world in order to be able to deal with it. So, according to structuralism, the human mind perceives difference in terms of opposites. which are called binary oppositions. So, what are binary oppositions? They are the two directly opposite ideas, each of which we understand by means of its opposition to the other. So, for instance, we understand up against down, female against male, good against evil, black as opposed to white, and so forth. So, we are making sense of the world in terms of binary opposition. This is a major approach of the structuralist school. So, the idea of structure in structuralism involves wholeness, transformation, and self regulation. What do we mean by each of them? By wholeness, we mean that the system functions as a unit. And so, it's not only merely a collection of independent items, but the components of any given structure. They form a working unit because they exist in relation to one another and they interact. So basically, the items or the words that are part of a single classification or a single category, uh, they interact with each other. They are not just discrete items under one bracket. There is a commonality in forming each of them with respect to the other. Next is transformation, which means that the system as a whole, a structure in itself is not static. It is dynamic, capable of change, and hence the system is not merely a structure. It structures. So, we are not only talking about a static system, we are talking about a system that dynamically functions towards structuring. So, in other words, new material is always being structured by the system and within the system. So, it's necessarily a dynamic, mutable, or mutating system, right? And then self regulation, which means the transformations of which a structure is capable never lead beyond its own structural system. So, even as it is transforming, even as it is mutating, it will never go beyond its uh, salient features. So, the third feature being self regulation, it refers to the transformations that the structure is capable of, which, however, never leads beyond its own structural system. So, even though a system or as a whole is ever static, it keeps, uh, mutating and modifying. It will never, engender or generate elements that are beyond its own laws, right? So, whatever happens as a result of transformation of this whole structure will always belong to the system. It will never be alienated from the system. The transformation will not lead to changing of the basic salient features of the structure. So, all the new elements engendered through transformation of the structure as a whole will still obey its salient features, its elementary features and characteristics. So, structuralism doesn't look for causes or origins of language. That is not something that interests the structuralists. Rather, it looks for rules that underlie language and governs how it functions. So, it is more interested in the meta language, if we may call it, rather than the language, the content of the language per se. So, talking about rules of grammar and meta language, we need to discuss Ferdinand de Saussure and his contributions. Structural linguistics was developed between 1913 and 1915 by Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist. However, his work was not translated into English and popularized until 1950s. Saussure rejects looking at any subject substantively for what it is itself, and rather prefers to look at, you know, any subject in relational terms, in relation to other subjects. So rather than a thing or a meaning in itself, what interests Saussure is the relational terms. So, his course, De Linguistique Générale, is an account that is put together from notes taken by his students, and it comprises a series of lectures that he had delivered at the University of Geneva between 1906 and 1911, and was published posthumously in 1915. And here he postulates that language should be studied not only in terms of its individual parts, but also in terms of the relationship between these parts, right? So, like I said, a subject not only in itself, but in relational terms. Further, Saussure emphasizes studying language not only in diachronic terms or diachronically, in other words, different, how language evolves um, across different time in the same space, but also synchronically. So, different space, same time. How language evolves in different spaces at the same time. So, diachronic study, which is evolution of language at different time in the same space, is a more historical reading or historical study of language, whereas synchronic reading is in terms of its current relevance. In other words, he proposes that a language should be studied as a unified field, what he calls as Just-in-Time-Height. So, prior to Saussure, there was a convention of studying language diachronically in terms of the history of changes in individual words over time, and it was assumed that words somehow imitated the objects for which they stood. Saussure realizes that we need to understand language not only as a collection of individual words with individual historical trajectory, but as a structural system of relationships among words as they are used at a given point in time. So, his focus, his contribution is this emphasis or this onus on synchronic study. Saussure's insistence on importance of the synchronic as distinct from the diachronic study of language was a very significant contribution because it involved recognition of language's current structural properties in addition to its diachronic or historical dimensions. So, Frederick Jameson observes, I quote, Saussure's originality was to have insisted on the fact that language as a total system is complete at any given point in time, no matter what happens to have been altered in it a moment before. So, language is a total system. Language as a total system is complete at every moment. In other words, each language has a valid existence at any given point, regardless of its historical trajectory, as system of sounds issuing from current speakers whose speech constructs and constitutes the language in its current form. So, at every given point in time, language as a contemporary phenomenon, as a as a uh, present reality or present phenomenon becomes a matter of study, a point of interest for Saussure, right? Saussure considers the whole phenomenon of language in terms of two fundamental dimensions which it exhibits. One that he calls as the structure of language or langue. Langue is the French word for language. And then he calls individual utterances that occur within that lung within, our speech, he calls that as parole. So on the one hand, we have the structure of language or lung. On the other, we have individual utterances that occur when we speak, or parole, right? So parole is a French word for speech. So for the structuralist school, lung is the proper object of study. On the other hand, parole is of interest only to the extent that it reveals lung. So parole is important with respect to its relation to lung. Lung is like the universal repository, the meta language, and parole is a dialect. So glimpses of the lung is available through individual parole. So lung is the overall system. Lung is the social product of the faculty of speech and a collection of necessary conventions that have been adopted by a social body or a social system so that individuals exercise their faculty of speech within that convention. So lung comprises meta language, the meta system of language, right? The rules of grammar. So lung encompasses the abstract language system, the systematic rules and conventions of a signifying order. It is independent of and it pre-exists, it precedes individual users who are basically not using the lung as a whole, but parts of it, are observable through their parole, through their dialect. So parole is the individual dialect. It is the individual personal phenomenon of language as a series of speech or speech acts made by a linguistic subject. So lung is the underlying structure of which parole is a part. So lung is a description of the full pattern of systematized relationships which individual utterance and understandings indicate and presuppose. So, according to Noam Chomsky, lung is an account of the system of competence that must precede and generate individual performance. So, it precedes and yet it provides, ingredients for uh, individual performance or utterance to be possible. Saussure compares Lang to the rules of chess. So the norms for playing the game is the Lang or the metalinguistic system. Whereas the moves, individual moves that a person chooses to make, the individual's preferences in playing the game or techniques or tactics of playing the game is parole. So, according to Saussure, language is an aggregate of separate units called words, each of which has a separate meaning attached to it. Language is intangible and it never appears all at once in its entirety. So, through one person's dialect, it's not possible to grasp or capture the entire language. Or meta language is available only in the incomplete performance of part of the repertoire through individual speakers. So, Saussure makes a very important contribution here. He states that a word is a linguistic sign. Any word is a linguistic sign comprising two parts, and these parts are interwoven, interrelated. One is the signifier, the other is the signified. The part of the sign that Saussure calls as the concept or meaning, okay, it is a mental impression or association of anything. It is called the signified. So, what is evoked in our mind? The mental concept. That is the signified. So, an example would be the idea of what Google is signified. the part that he calls as sound image. So the mental imprint or linguistic sign given to the thing is called the signifier. It refers to the sound that the Google's logo creates in our minds, right? So the sound created in our mind corresponding to viewing the Google's logo. The sound image is the signifier. The concept or meaning is the signified. So, when we see the linguistic unit Google, it is the sign, and we automatically connect it to its sound image, the sound of Google and the logo, with what it refers to. What does Google refer to? A search machine on the internet, right? So, it is also important to note that there is nothing in the word Google that would suggest that it is a digital means for searching information on the internet. So, Google is a random invented word. A word is not merely a signifier, nor is it merely a signifier. So, a word cannot be only a sound image or only a concept. A sound image becomes a word only when it is linked with a concept. So, signifier plus signified, that's how the sign is formed. The linguistic unit or sign is formed. So, we also need to understand that the relation between signifier and signified is arbitrary. There is no necessary connection between a given sound image and the concept to which it refers. In other words, construction of a language is a product of human faculty, right? And it is not natural. Language is not natural. The connection between signifier and signified is arbitrary. For instance, there is no reason why the concept of a tree should be represented to the sound image of tree, and why we should not, rather connect it with the sound image of arbor. So, tree is what we call it in English, arbor is what we call it, and the same thing in French. So, as a relation between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary, there is no direct connection between the image and the concept. For instance, there is no reason why CAT produce the image of a four-legged animal in our mind. Why does it produce the image of the same animal in everyone's mind? It is only because of convention. There is no reason why that animal should be called CAT or cat. So speakers of the same language group have agreed that these letters will evoke this particular image, right? The idea that signifiers or linguistic sound images do not refer to things in the world but to concepts in our mind is very important for structuralism. Objects are not available in the world according to the words or terms that we tag them with. We don't discover the world, we create it according to the innate structures in our human mind. So these structures have nothing natural in the world about them. A sign, therefore, stands for something to somebody in some respect. So it stands for an object to an interpretant in a given context. These conditions refer to the process by which sign signifies, right? So, depending, now we are also talking about signification or the interpretative meaning, right? Who is interpreting and in what context? That is also incumbent on the meaning. That's also something that that shapes the meaning or signification. The relation between the signifier and the signified, therefore, determines the process of semiosis. In Cervantes' Don Quixote, which is a very peculiar, example of wordplay. We see the protagonist, Don Quixote, is, subverting the world system by breaking down the conventions of old literary modes and styles. So this man goes on to call a basin as a helmet, a windmill as a giant, and so forth, by which he's subverting the conventional relations of signifier and signified, and the social sign which holds language together, therefore falls apart. So, according to his individual worldview, he is renaming things rather, and the um, linguistic convention actually falls apart. He rips apart the linguistic convention. So, uh, as an autonomous concrete entity that draws attention to itself and systematically intensifies its own linguistic qualities, poetry is something that exists beyond its message. So, according to Saussure, poetry ceases to be a signifier and it becomes a signified. So, in the form itself, the meaning is present. In the case of a of a poem, in the case of poetry, a verse freedom from its habitual referent ultimately invokes its potential freedom to combine with enormous number of referents. So this is called poetic freedom also. In other words, a poetic use of a word makes ambiguity as a notable feature of its performance. And this is what alters poetry's structural role from that of a signifier to a signified, right? Structuralism comprises a system at the level of phonology and also another at the level of morphology. I will very quickly define these two. Phonology is the study of elementary speech sounds or phonemes in a given language. So, phoneme is the minimal or smallest distinctive contrastive sound unit of a language. It is a minimal unit because it cannot be further subdivided. It is distinctive because when one phoneme is substituted by another, it actually changes the meaning. Morphology is the study of how phonemes combine to form words and other morphemes. So, what is a morpheme? A morpheme is composed of one or more phonemes, multiple phonemes, and it is a unit that repeats a language with the same or at least similar meaning. So, a morpheme could be a complete word such as man, or it could be part of a word in the form of prefix or suffix such as disgraceful or distressed and so forth, right? So a sound's function is determined by what it is phonemically felt to oppose as much as by what it actually phonetically is, right? So identity of phoneme is determined solely by the relations of its difference with other phonemes in a given system. So, the chief characteristic of a phoneme is that it is different from other phonemes. This is basically the premise of structuralist school, understanding a definition through its juxtaposition with other, other objects, other items within the system. So, meanings of words likewise are also relational or differential in nature. No word can be defined in isolation from another. And each word is therefore connected to the other words through paradigmatic chain. So, what is yellow? We cannot define yellow, but we can, come to arrive at some kind of concept through the uh, deduction method. So, it is not green, it is not black, nor white, nor red. Hence, it is yellow, something like that. So Saussure says, I quote, language has neither ideas or signified, nor sounds or signifier that existed before the linguistic system. but only conceptual and phonic differences that have issued from the system. So rather than the definition of the thing in itself, the way they existed primarily was in terms of conceptual and phonic differences within a system. Both Saussure and Roman Jakobson look at language as a double system. So they agree with the concept of fundamental signifying role of binary oppositions in shaping of meaning, or meaning formed through negation or the deduction process, which which I explained a while back through the example of what is yellow, right? Similarly, we see another structuralist named Algirdas Julian Reimers. So A.J. Reimers uh, sees, oppositions as underlying what he terms as elementary structure of signification. So any elementary structure of signification has an underlying perception of oppositions. In other words, meanings take shape through perception of differences. Reimers is not so much interested in the works of literature as he is in the nature of the grammar that generates them. So, the fundamental structures of man's language informs and shapes the fundamental structures of his stories. In other words, all stories spring from the same grammar, right? This is something that Reimers contributes to the structuralist school. This grammar that he's talking about is very much like the metalinguistic system, the meta language or lang, whereas individual stories are like individual dialects or parole. So, according to Reimers, the structure of the enunciation spectacle remains the same. So, what he calls as enunciation spectacle is the grammar. And its manifestations change depending on the various actants who embody and perform it. And this is similar to Lang's relation with parole. Once again, actants basically refer to themes, right? So the actant could be presented in the function of one or more characters in the story and speak to the story's underlying oppositional structure. So, enunciation spectacle is like the repository of the structure from which individual stories emerge or arise. And any story is made possible only through an oppositional structure. So, the oppositional structure or conflict actually adds a torque acts as a propellant to the story, to the narrative structure or to the plot. So the deep structure of the narrative generates and defines the story's symbol or theme or actant beyond the story's surface content. Several characters can represent the same actant or theme. Conversely, one character can represent a number of themes or actants or symbols. So, the relationship of disjunction and conjunction, conflict and reconciliation among the different actants shape a narrative. So, this conjunction, reconciliation, conflicts, these actually act as a torque or a propellant to a narrative. The different elements disposed with different functions prop up the narrative structure. Similar to Reimers, Tzvetan Todorov also believes that there is a deeper narrative structure underlying all individual stories. This narrative structure acts as a universal repertoire of grammar. So Todorov studies in this context, he studies three different aspects of any given narrative. So what are these three aspects? The semantic aspects, which is the content of the narrative, and then how the various structures in the narrative combine, right? This is the syntactical aspect. And then the words and phrases used for telling a story, which comprises the verbal aspect. So, semantic or the content, and then how the various structures combine, which is the syntactic part or syntactical aspect, and then the words or phrases used for telling a story, which is the verbal aspect. These three aspects interest Todorov's study. And while Rimus's onus was on the semantic aspect, Todorov's interest is more on the structure or syntax, right? So, according to Todorov, propositions, what he calls as propositions, are the fundamental units that form the different structures of a narrative. A proposition is a combination of a noun with either an adjective or a verb. So, how does a narrative move forward in time? A noun, or basically a character, should either have an attribute or must have done something, committed some action. This becomes the, starting point of any plot. So, noun combined with an adjective or with a verb. Depending on the way one proposition combines with the other, there can be different types of sequences in a narrative. The temporal relations, which involves a linear succession of time, logical relations where plot advances through logic of causality, and finally spatial relations where there are multiple parallel subplots. Then we see that relation among different propositions also determine whether a structure of sequences is attributive or retributive. So, story that is progressing through presentation of characters is uh, attributive in nature, right? And a story that moves forward in terms of or something that is concerned with laws and breaching of laws and punishment of lawbreakers, that is the retributive proposition. So, structuralists insist studying the social and cultural phenomena such as the advertisements, games as sign systems. So, while a natural object like tree has all its intrinsic qualities known to us, something that is man-made, something that is very cultural in nature, such as a soccer match, a football match, is a system of signification that only the members of the culture would know, right? The rules of any football match would be known only to the members who belong to uh, this culture. Similarly, the ads or any ritual, any wedding ritual, or any uh, particular place that is bound to certain conventions. The external actions that take place on the field of a soccer match function as signifiers through which they relate to some understanding, some concept that is the signified or the meaning. The entire cultural domain of a society can be seen as consisting of human productions that have a certain meaning for the members of that particular culture. So, this action on the field that acts as signifier, the and referring to certain meaning, corresponding meaning which is signified, applies only to the members of that culture where soccer match is known, where soccer match is played and functional as as a known game. Similarly, be it mythologies, be it marriage rites or any other, rites and rituals, social norms, games, literary creations, such as poetry and novel, they are all very community centric, very community bound. They are specific to certain cultures, and and otherwise they may not make any sense to someone who is not intrinsic to that culture, who is not trained in that culture. So the cultural meaning of any particular act or object is shaped by a whole system of constitutive rules which make possible particular norms of behavior. The way we react or we behave as social beings, as collective beings, um, during any rituals or rites, or the way we respond to a piece of art, or even a joke, it is shaped by a system of constitutive rules which make certain behaviors, certain gestures as possible, even reflexive in nature. We know how to act in a certain context, in a certain condition, because that is how we have been trained in our culture. So there is nothing natural about it. Someone who is extrinsic to that culture would not know how to act in that particular situation. In mythologies, Roland Barthes discusses the sociology of signs, symbols, and collective representation. Barthes makes a semiotic commentary on popular cultural objects as a way of understanding the symbolic value of these objects. Semiological analysis refers to the study of meanings that come up in our everyday system of communication. Semiotics are in everything that we can understand as a sign. So, Bach reflects on myths. What are myths? Myths are constructed by by means of attaching a meaning to a form. And the form usually is empty, and this relation between meaning and form is very much man-made, or made possible by a civilization, or a culture, and hence this relationship is arbitrary. According to Bach's study, myths are the signs that are embedded within our systems of signification, and they are expressed through our communication. And study of myths enable us to demonstrate how given social systems uh, mold into the fabric of the collective consciousness. How these symbols become part of an intrinsic and natural to our collective consciousness, and hence there is a tendency to think that the myths are natural. So as the myth freezes the linkage of meaning and form, in other words, the myth appears as natural, and we stop asking why we do what we do during a ritual. uh, they implicitly give a historical intention, a natural justification. So, in other words, we make anything contingent appear eternal. So, something that has been created by uh, a collective humanity, by a civilization, uh, is made to look like something eternal, something timeless and natural. When we freeze this meaning between, in this link between meaning and form, and we don't question how and why they are connected. But explains the difference between wrestling and boxing in this context, and he looks at both these games in terms of structural analysis, which explains two different cultural conventions and expectations of the audience. So, in the case of boxing, it is based on the demonstration of excellence. Interest is thus directed towards the final outcome, and visible suffering would be read only as a sign of imminent defeat. So, boxing is basically a match, the way a sports takes place. So, when a person suffers, it's a sign of defeat. Wrestling, on the other hand, is a drama on stage, enacted on stage, in which each moment is immediately intelligible as a spectacle. So, wrestlers are not really sports persons, but physical caricatures. They are symbols that are cast in moral roles, and the outcome is of interest only because they are playing, they are embodying archetypes or certain symbols. So, boxing rules are external to the match, designating limits beyond which one must not go, whereas wrestling rules are meant to be violated. The whole, excitement around this drama of wrestling pertains to or is associated with this transgression or violating of rules, violating of conventions, which increase the range of meanings that can be produced. From here, I will very quickly talk about structural anthropology, which is a contribution by Claude Levi-Strauss, and that's where we will wrap up today. So, Levi-Strauss applied structuralism to study phenomena such as kinship relations in societies and also to understand mythologies. So, Levi-Strauss applied structuralism to study phenomena such as kinship relations in society, mythologies, and so forth. Roland Barthes applied structuralism to understand literary texts and cultural artifacts such as fashion, advertisement, and wrestling. So, in the late 1950s, Claude Levi-Strauss, a structural anthropologist, seeks the underlying common denominators, or what he calls as the structures, which link human beings regardless of the differences at the surface level. Uh, or he claims that the cultures may be different at the surface level, or the surface phenomena of the cultures are different. However, there is an underlying structure that binds them all. So, despite the very different ritual forms in which different cultures express important aspects of community life, uh, he argued that all human cultures have some codes as common, which define, for instance, mate selection, kinship ties, initiation into adulthood, rites of passage, and so forth. Structural anthropologists would argue uh, that the differences are only at the level of surface phenomena or at the level of parole. So, the differences in cultures, the differences in which we enact our cultures are only at the level of parole or the uh, dialect application, different applications of the same underlying grammar, right? So, beyond the rites and rituals on the surface, the cultural practices have some same underlying structures, like the same metalinguistic system or lang. So, according to Levi Strauss, the primitive peoples respond to the world through a poetic wisdom that he calls as myth making. So, both Levi Strauss and Marx note that men make their own history, but they do not know that they are making it. Uh, Levi Strauss also shares Giambattista Vico's interest in language as a major aspect of the science of man. He argues that language constitutes the prototype of cultural phenomenon, which distinguishes man from animals, and yet a phenomenon through which all forms of social life are established and perpetuated, which connects man with the animaldom. So, language basically distinguishes man from animals, and yet it acts as a continuity between humans and other animals. So it's a kind of connecting thread that connects humans with all forms of lives. So it distinguishes humanity and yet connects it with all forms of lives. Uh, Levi-Strauss's main contribution is bricolage. It's a term that Levi-Strauss mentions in his two major works, Totemism, that came out in 1962, and The Savage Mind, that came out in the same year. So, bricolage is basically is a major contribution he makes. It's a skill of using whatever is at hand and then recombining them to create something new, reshuffling of the order as a way of as a way of placing the onus on transitoriness over permanence. So, what Levi Strauss points out here is that signs that are already in existence can be used for purposes that they were originally not meant for. So it is the ancestral ways of doing and being which persists in today's modern industrial civilization. Bricolage therefore refers to how mythical thoughts work, selecting fragments or leftovers of previous cultural formations towards redeploying them and making something new out of the new combinations. A bricoleur expresses itself by means of heterogeneous and extensive repertoire. The working or functioning of a bricoleur is parallel to the patterns of mythological thoughts and constructions of mythological narratives. And this is very different from how the modern Western science works, or how, the mindset of an engineer, for example, works. While the modern Western science focuses or places its onus on holistic totalizing systems, uh, in which there are elements of permanence, Bricoleur is talking about deconstruction and reconstruction, thereby um, pointing to the temporary nature of objects or meanings. So, bricolage can also be seen as an ideological construct which suggests a set of suppositions about science and technology that we see in the post war world. It refers to the means by which the non technical mind, which is also known as the savage or primitive mind, responds to the world around him. So, the savage mind or the primitive mind involves a science of the concrete. It is opposed to the civilized science of the abstract. And so, this primitive mind orders, classifies, and arranges the physical world in terms of structures by an alternative logic. So, these structures are improvised, they are ad hoc responses to a given environment, and they serve to establish homologies and analogies between the ordering of nature and that of the society. So, the traditional point of view is relativist in nature, and its science of concrete, the science of concrete that it proposes, refers to the non Western systems of classification and the relative autonomy of representations, which is opposed to the materialistic reductionist worldview that the Western scientific world proposes. So, while bricolage refers to a more creative, mutative, uh, ad hoc, an immediate process which is not looking for permanence of meanings and hence giving a more, a relative autonomy of a representation. The Western worldview focuses on permanence and hence, reductionist meanings or significations. Um, So, in art criticism, we see that bricolage refers to creation from a diverse range of materials or sources, and it comprises a miscellaneous collection. A significant feature of bricolage is the ease with which it enables the non civilized, non literate bricoleur to establish analogy between life and nature, right? So a bricoleur is not interested in pure stable truths or meanings, or permanent systems that he or she uses. Rather, they are interested in what's there to get a particular job done. So he or she uses a bricoleur uses a signifier with the awareness that it does not hold any stable meanings. Bricolage thus does not worry about the coherence of the words or ideas it uses. Bricolage understands meaning not as something eternal and immutable, but as meaning that is constantly in a flux, that is shifting, that is provisional and temporary in nature. So it is pointing to the process of construction, deconstruction, and further reconstruction, right? So with this, we come to the end of our lecture and discussion today. Let's meet with a new topic and another round of discussions in our next lecture. Thank you.